The first people to reach Australia didn't discover a new continent. They knew exactly what they were doing. We've framed this story as exploration. Brave wanderers stumbling onto an unknown shore, lucky to have survived the crossing. That framing is wrong. What the evidence actually shows is something harder to explain and far more interesting. Not accident. Not luck. A decision made deliberately by people who looked out at open water with nothing visible on the other side and chose to keep going anyway. 65,000 years ago, someone paddled across at least 90 kilometers of open ocean and then did it again, with enough people to found a civilization. Here's what makes this crossing different from anything else in human prehistory. When humans walked out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they were following coastlines, rivers, plains, land. Even the crossing into the Americas, via the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, was a land route. Animals made those migrations too. The fossil record is full of species that traveled those corridors. Australia is different. The Wallace Line is a deep water channel running between the Indonesian islands and the Australian continent. It was identified in the 19th century by naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who noticed something strange. The animals on the eastern side of the line were completely different from the animals on the western side. Marsupials on one side, placental mammals on the other, species that had never mixed, because the channel never closed. Even at the absolute lowest sea levels during ice ages, when vast amounts of water were locked in glaciers and coastlines extended significantly further than today, the Wallace Line remained open ocean, not a land bridge, not a shallow ford. Deep water, stretching for over 90 kilometers with no visible land at the horizon. No land animal had ever crossed it. In the entire history of life on this continent, until 65,000 years ago, nothing with legs had made it to the other side. When naturalists and zoologists first mapped the distribution of species across Southeast Asia, the line between marsupial Australia and placental mainland Asia was so sharp, so absolute, that it seemed impossible it could be natural. But it was. Deep water, maintained across millions of years and multiple ice ages, was enough. It was enough to keep two entire evolutionary lineages completely separate, until humans decided it wasn't. You're standing on a beach on the island of Sulawesi. The year is roughly 65,000 BCE. The water in front of you is deep blue, and it doesn't end. You've seen birds come from that direction. You've seen debris in the current. Something is out there. The question is whether it's close enough to reach, whether you'll survive the crossing, and whether you can convince enough people to go with you. Because you can't go alone. Not practically. A founding population requires numbers. Genetic modeling suggests at least 130 to 150 individuals for a viable long-term population. That's not a single raft. That's an organized operation. Multiple watercraft. Enough food and water for days at sea. Navigation by stars and current and wave patterns, developed through experience on shorter crossings. This was not improvised. In 2017, archaeologist Chris Clarkson and his team published findings from Madjedbebe rock shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia. Stone tools found at the site dated to approximately 65,000 years ago, pushing back the known date of human arrival in Australia by nearly 20,000 years. The tools were sophisticated. Grinding stones for processing plant food, pigments for possible body decoration or art. The people who made them were not lost wanderers washing up on an unknown shore. They were culturally complex, technologically capable, and they arrived in large enough numbers to sustain a population. The boat doesn't exist in the archaeological record. Nothing organic from 65,000 years ago survives. We don't know if it was a bamboo raft, a bark canoe, an outrigger, or something we haven't imagined. We know it worked. We know it carried enough people. We know they navigated successfully across open water with no landmarks, using only stars, currents, and whatever knowledge they'd accumulated from shorter sea crossings. There's a site on the island of East Timor, Jerimalai Cave, where archaeologists found fish bones dating to 42,000 years ago. Deep sea fish. The kind that live far offshore, in open water. Someone was fishing them. With hooks or lines or nets we can't recover. This is not coastal foraging. This is deliberate, skilled, deep-sea fishing, requiring watercraft capable of significant ocean travel. The ocean wasn't a barrier, it was a road. But here is the thing that the evidence can't give us, and that I keep coming back to. Whoever first made this crossing couldn't have known Australia existed. You can't see it from any point in the island chain. There's no landmark to navigate toward. You sail east, and you either find land eventually, or you die trying. Every previous crossing a human had ever made, every river, every strait, every short channel, had a destination visible from the departure point. You could see where you were going. The risk was calculable. This was different. This was sailing toward nothing, toward a horizon that offered no promise, no visible reward, no guarantee of return. The current doesn't bring you back easily. Many of the people who attempted this crossing may not have survived. We only know about the ones who did, because their descendants are still in Australia. Why did they go? Population pressure is one answer. Too many people in the island chain, not enough resources. Conflict is another. Displacement by stronger groups forcing weaker ones to take risks they wouldn't otherwise take. Climate shift, forcing coastal populations to move as sea levels changed. All of these are plausible. None of them alone explains why the first crossing happened when it did, or why enough people agreed to go at once. There's a mutation that researchers have identified in some human populations, DRD4-7R, sometimes called the wanderlust gene, that correlates with novelty-seeking, risk tolerance, and a drive toward exploration. It's more common in populations with long migratory histories. That's correlation, not causation. But it raises a question. Were the people who first made this crossing just braver, or were they wired differently in some specific way? Or was it simpler than any of those explanations? The need to find out what's on the other side. What the Madjedbebe site represents is not just an older date for human arrival in Australia. It's evidence that 65,000 years before we invented writing, before we built cities, before we developed agriculture, before any of the things we use to define civilization, humans were capable of long-range collective planning, maritime navigation, and the specific kind of courage that goes into sailing toward a horizon you can't see past. Courage is maybe the wrong word. Curiosity, possibly. Or necessity. Or something that doesn't have a clean name in any language we speak today. Someone stood on that shore, looked at the open water, and decided that whatever was out there was worth the risk of never coming back. The people alive in Australia today, the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, are the direct descendants of that decision. 65,000 years of continuous culture, built on a foundation of one crossing that had no guarantee of survival, toward a destination nobody knew existed. Every civilization begins somewhere. Most begin on land, following game or following rivers. This one began on the open ocean. Think about what it cost to make it.